On Wednesday, September 11th, 2013, Dr. Ray Hilborn of the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences testified before the House Committee on Natural Resources during a hearing on the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. Dr. Hilborn explained that while the Magnuson-Stevens Act does mandate the protection of our fisheries resources, the Act makes clear that those resources should be protected so they can be used for the benefit of our citizens and their communities. In his presentation, Dr. Hilborn made the point that while government agencies routinely report on our success at eliminating overfishing, they rarely report on our nation's success at making the fisheries resource a better provider of nourishment, or the success or failure of government policies in terms of maintaining the economic vitality of the industry. Dr. Hilborn's presentation before the committee was limited to 5 minutes, in accordance with congressional hearing rules. So we asked him if he would sit down with us to provide his full presentation without a time limit for the Saving Seafood audience. We were able to catch up with Dr. Hilborn after he delivered his testimony on Capitol Hill.
I started by just asking, I really want to ask, how are we doing in the management of U.S. fisheries? And it seems to me the first step is to ask, what are the objectives of U.S. fisheries management? And they're really a dual purpose. It's you provide for the conservation and management of the fisheries, but you want to assure that the citizens benefit from the employment, food supply, and revenue which could be generated. And really, the conservation is essentially a necessary part of generating those benefits. And if you read the Act, employment, food supply, and revenue seem to be what it's about. And in order to do that, one of the things you have to do is you have to conserve the resource. Now, what I find so interesting is that when NIMS reports to Congress on the performance of U.S. fisheries, the only measure the report to Congress contains is how much overfishing is going on. In other words, then eliminating overfishing is a means to an end. It's a means to generating sustainable food, employment, and revenue. But it's not the end in itself. And yet I think in the last 15 years, we have become completely focused on overfishing as if that was stopping overfishing was the objective of fisheries management. And it's not. The objective is to produce food, jobs, and profit in a long-term sustainable way. Now, I'm going to present some data that comes from a database that a group of us has been preparing and adding on to since 2007 that is essentially the status of fish stocks as reported by scientific bodies, mostly government agencies. So in the U.S., this pretty well all comes from NIMS or from state governments. And this database has proved the basis for 27 scientific papers, including 10 in the premier journals of Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
Is this an official group, Dr. Hilborn, or is this an ad hoc group? Is it academics? Who's in the group?
It's an ad hoc group that is mostly academics. There are some, particularly from other countries, there's some agency people. There's some agency people within the U.S. as well, but it's really an ad hoc group of people who are interested in the project. So let me just give you a little bit of a refresher on how we evaluate the status of fisheries, and we're interested traditionally in two things: how many fish are there? That's what we call the stock size, and how hard are we fishing? What's the fishing pressure? And what that graph shows is in the bullseye is the area that is where we expect to produce the long-term maximum sustainable benefits. That there's a level of fishing pressure that achieves it, and at that fishing pressure we expect the stock size. And that level of fishing pressure and stock size are expected to produce the long-term maximum sustainable yield. And now in the U.S. we've adopted within these two dimensions a set of classifications. So anything over than that target level of fishing pressure we call overfishing. You're fishing harder than you would need to in order to produce maximum sustainable yield. And as you get to lower abundances, we classify stocks as overfished. So where you don't want to be is in the upper left-hand corner, which I've shaded red, and that's where you're both overfished, too few fish, and fishing too hard. Now in the lower left, the stock is at reduced abundance, which many people are now calling depleted. It's traditionally called overfished, but you've reduced fishing pressure enough that rebuilding is expected. And then that green zone is an area that is generally classified as fully exploited. And if you're on the right-hand side, you're definitely underexploited. And one of the things I find interesting is that we call anything above the target level of fishing pressure, or the fishing pressure that produces maximum sustained yield, we call that overfish.
I was going to ask you that, and you and your wife
overfishing,
quite literally wrote the book by the Oxford University Press on overfishing. But overfishing, because a stock is in the situation of overfishing occurring, it doesn't necessarily mean that is happening because of fishing.
Well, that's an important point, and in fact, many stocks get depleted for a whole bunch of other reasons: climate change, environmental change, movement of predators, and things like that. And so I'll actually concentrate that on that more. But I should say that because of the concern about overfishing, in general, the U.S. doesn't treat the fishing pressure that produces maximum sustained yield as a target. It treats it as a limit and said if you go over that, you're doing something bad. Now, if you think about fisheries managers as marksmen, and if they wanted to produce the maximum employment, the maximum food, the maximum revenue, you would expect to see individual stocks shooting around this target. You might have some up and left a little bit, down and right, and if a well-managed set of fish stocks would scatter around that target. If that was your target, and that is the target that we believe would produce maximum profit, jobs, and revenue, and be sustainable. Now, if you look at the status in the United States, this is a graph for the west coast of the United States, not Alaska, just the Washington, Oregon, California. And in this case, again, the big plus sign is that the target that maximizes revenue, profit, and jobs. And the size of the circle tells you the size of the stock, what its potential long-term sustainable yield could be. And what you see is that on average, we are fishing much, much less than it would take to maximize jobs, revenue, and food. And
help us understand the two axes.
So this is how many fish you have, one being your target to produce maximum profit, jobs, and revenue, or revenue, jobs, and food, and the y-axis is what fraction you're harvesting. And that those fractions are going to depend upon the stock. A long-lived species, a 1 here would be a very low harvest rate. So, something like a shark or a rockfish would be very low. For something that's very short-lived, like sardines or mackerel or menhaden, the amount of fishing pressure would be higher, and this is scaled. So 1 is where you want to be to produce maximum food. And what you see is that almost every stock is well below the target level of fishing pressure. That this black line here is essentially the average. And we have in the West Coast, we have a couple stocks that are currently being fished too hard, and we still have a fair number that are down below the target levels. That is, these would be called overfished down here. Now, if we look at the U.S. total. Now it's the same basic structure, except the color now indicates where they're from. So green is Alaska, so the really big ones are Alaskan stocks. Blue is the West Coast. Red is New England. And yellow is the Gulf and Southeast. And what you see is really the same story, that the average is well below the level that would maximize catch, sustainably maximize catch. But we do have more, particularly from New England. We have a lot more stocks that are currently being fished too hard and are at too low an abundance. So if we, again, as I said, we've got this obsession with overfishing as the fisheries issue. And if we say, okay, what would it take to maximize food production, revenue, and jobs, and how much could we gain by stopping overfishing, which seems to be the implicit assumption. The assumption seems to be that that's what we need to do. That in fact, our estimates are that we would only increase the yield of fish by 1 to 3%. That the stocks that are being overfished are relatively few, and also they tend to be small stocks. Whereas, if you ask, well, how much yield are we losing by underfishing? If we continue fishing those stocks at that rate, we're losing somewhere between 30 and 50% of our potential yield by underfishing. So that at present, in terms of generating what I believe the Magnuson-Stevens Act is about, sustainable benefits to the United States, the underutilization is a far bigger threat than overfishing. Let me just talk about some other research that's related to the theme of the hearings that are went on yesterday, and that is rebuilding plans. And the assumption behind most fisheries management is that maintaining a stock at or around a certain biomass level will maximize productivity. And this is data for the Icelandic cod, which just happens to be a very important stock. The whole Icelandic economy depends upon it. And what you see is that on average, there is a population size that produces the long-term highest average productivity. This productivity is how many tons of fish you could sustainably catch at that population size in that year. But you also see that that's a very poor relationship. That curve does not explain much of the data. Another way to look at the data is to look at the productivity over time. And what you see is that there was a very clear jump, or decline in this case, in productivity of this stock in the mid-1980s. And the Icelandic scientists have recognized that. They have some explanations for it. But in fact, the change in productivity in Icelandic cod hasn't been a function of what the biomass was, but rather largely a function of time. And we did a study of 230 individual stocks, and of those we found that for 69% of them, these jumps in productivity really explained the changes in production much better than whether you were at the target biomass or not. And this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the implication for this is that it really isn't as important to get the stock to the right biomass as it is to keep the fishing pressure right, so that the stock, if it's in good conditions, it will be at a high biomass. If it's in bad productivity, it'll be at a lower biomass. But getting the fishing pressure right is the key issue. And that was highlighted by the National Academy of Sciences recent report. It said, rather than trying to achieve target biomasses, let's try to achieve target fishing mortality rates. That is, we control the y-axis on those graphs. We can't control the x-axis very much. So we call these changes in productivity regime shifts. That is, productivity comes in runs of high and low, largely unrelated to the abundance of the stock. Now, there are many reasons to maintain stocks at high abundance, but the expectation that rebuilding stocks will rapidly lead to an increase in productivity does not appear to be true. That you're going to have to wait for the environment to change before the productivity is going to increase. And so, again, to reemphasize my conclusion, the conclusion of the NRC panel, is we should seek fishing strategies that are robust to such regime shifts and exploitation rate strategies, trying to, say, harvest the stock consistently at 20 or 30%, rather than trying to stop fishing until it rebuilds to a target level, will generate much higher long-term benefits. So in conclusion, the U.S. has largely solved the overfishing problem. And it's done so by layering so much precaution into our system that the major threat to producing benefits is now underutilization rather than overfishing. Regime shifts in productivity mean that short-term rebuilding targets often cannot be met even with a total cessation of fishing. Benefits to the nation will be better achieved by aiming for exploitation rate targets rather than biomass targets, and the consequences of the current rebuilding targets and timelines is highly disruptive to recreational and commercial fishing and contributes very little to the long-term sustainability of the resource. Thank you.
So you said we've largely solved the overfishing problem, but one of your graphs clearly showed that there still are, particularly in New England, a number of species for which either overfishing is occurring or the biomass is insufficiently high. But how far away are we from that situation being corrected?
Well, we're going to always have some stocks that are called overfished, that is, or where their biomass is lower than we would like to see it, okay? Even if we stopped fishing, that would happen because of this natural variability. And when you combine fishing, which definitely reduces the abundance of fish in the ocean, you're going to have some stocks at low abundance. But though they're not necessarily going to be producing a lot less sustainable yield because they're there. That's the overfished, that's the abundance side. On the fishing pressure side, in theory, we can control that. But the problem in New England now has largely been one of imprecise science. That we thought we had a lot more Gulf of Maine cod than we think we have now. Therefore, what we thought was not overfishing turns out, with the current level of science, to be considered overfishing. And I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. There's always going to be imprecision in science, and some stocks will be fished harder than our targets. But some stocks will be fished lower than our targets. And from the total benefit to the nation perspective, that's just the way, we want the average to be the level that produces the most benefits. And some will be fished a little bit too hard, some will be fished not hard enough. And the less precise our science is, then the more spread there's going to be, the bigger spread around the target there would be.
I'm interested in your discussion of regime shifts, because that sounds as though that could explain the situations both of, for example, suddenly there being 6 times more pollock in New England than we thought, or suddenly there being not as much cod as we thought. How do we know when a regime shift is occurring or has occurred, or can we not know that?
It turns out to be very difficult. It takes, what we've done is we've taken what's often 40 years of data retrospectively and said, can we now tell when there were regime shifts? And the answer seems to be reasonably so. But our ability to tell that at the time they're happening is very, very weak. And it's very imprecise. And so we can't really manage our systems and saying, the regime has changed, we need to change our management. What we need to do is basically harvest at a rate that is going to be robust to whether we're in a good regime or a bad regime. And the consequences will be that when we're in bad regimes, we're going to have a lot fewer fish on the ground, and the catches will be a lot lower than when we're in a good regime. I mean, the catches can't stay constant. The catches have to go up and down. But what the 10-year rebuilding requirement doing is whipsawing the variation much, much, much more than it would need to be if we applied a constant, robust harvest rate.
If we move to an exploitation rate rather than a biomass target, I think for those of us who aren't fishery scientists, it makes one wonder, well, how do we know then we're not over-exploiting and bringing the biomass to a point where it will be what some people like to call a situation where the species has crashed?
Well, I mean, if the population continues to decline at low levels, then you're clearly fishing too hard. That the target exploitation rate is too high. That you're going to expect stocks to go up and down, but if they get down to the low levels, to that left-hand side of that graph, and they continue to decline, then you clearly need to reduce your exploitation rate. Certainly the fishery councils I work with the most on the West Coast, we have automatic rules to do that. We basically reduce the fraction you harvest as the stock starts dropping below the target. So we're not aiming for a constant exploitation rate. We're aiming for an exploitation rate when the stock is up in the abundant range. But as it starts to decline, we reduce the exploitation rate. And preliminary work suggests that strategy is probably pretty robust to regime shifts. Because you have to reduce your exploitation rate when you go into an unproductive regime. But again, what the 10-year rebuilding requirement does is it whipsaws things, because all of a sudden, if you reach that overfish threshold, which I might say is for many stocks not very different than the level that would produce maximum sustained yield, then all of a sudden you're forced into this 10-year rebuilding requirement, which can require dramatic changes in fishing, sometimes almost complete cessation of fishing. So we're taking the natural variability that fish stocks show, and we're essentially magnifying it and putting it on top of catch, whereas an alternative is to sort of split the variability and have some of the variability taken in catch and some of it taken in the actual abundance of fish on the ground.
On your first slide, yesterday you reminded the committee, and you remind us today, of the objective of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, to provide for the conservation and management of the fisheries, to rebuild fish stocks, to ensure conservation, to protect essential habitat, but to ensure that our citizens benefit from the employment, food supply, and revenue which could be generated. On your next slide, if you'll move forward, I believe you point out that the only report that Congress receives on performance relates to overfishing. So the only measurement that the administrative agencies are currently providing to Congress to determine if we are adhering with the Magnuson Act pertains to overfishing, not to the delivery of benefits. How would, I presume you'd like to see immediately reports to Congress that focus on the delivery of benefits from the resource?
Yeah, that I think, and that wouldn't be very hard to do. The approach we've used is pretty standard. Now, we've only done it for yield, but you could also do it for jobs. And in fact, I'm working right now, some people in my group are working on doing that for jobs and per revenue, and to report, I mean, they should report how much yield we're losing, how many jobs we're losing by overfishing, and how many jobs we're losing by underfishing. And I know what the answer is going to be. It's going to be far, far greater losses due to underfishing than overfishing. Now, that's not to say that the objectives of the U.S. necessarily need to be maximization of jobs. My reading of the Act is that's basically true. But certainly a lot of environmental NGOs would like to argue for much, much lower fishing pressure so we have less overall impact in the ocean. I think Congress needs to be a little bit explicit about what it is. And again, my reading of the Act suggests that it's really food, jobs, and revenue are pretty high. I mean, we know if you want to maximize the profit from fishing, you fish a little bit less than you would to maximize the yield. So you spend less money on fuel and things like that, have a little higher abundance. So it's not, there's a range of alternative objectives of fisheries, and a lot of the NGOs have pretty clear, objectives. I mean, some of them really their objective is to stop fishing, as near as I can tell, or certainly stop any industrial fishing. The NGOs, again, they're not particularly specific about it, but certainly in their pushing for, some of them pushing for more restrictive fishing, it clearly means they think we're fishing still too hard on average.
Dr. Hilborn, if you were for a few weeks, a month, or a year to switch jobs and leave being a professor at the University of Washington and instead be a representative of the state of Washington to Congress, what would be your top list of things you'd like to see changed in the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act?
Okay, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has been very successful at rebuilding American fisheries, getting rid of the foreign fleets. I mean, people tend to forget that's what it was originally about, and it's been very successful. And so it's really a question of fine-tuning. And I think I would be pushing to try to find a social consensus on what our objectives are, and those might be different region by region. In some regions, one of the objective might be to maximize recreational fishing rather than commercial fishing. Who knows? We need to seek regional solutions, but we need to identify what are our objectives, and then have performance measures about how we're doing with respect to those objectives. And as I said, I just think that in the last 15 years, we seem to have adopted stopping overfishing as the only objective, and it clearly isn't what we're trying to do with American fisheries. It's a means to an end.
Dr. Ray Hilborn of the University of Washington, thank you for joining us here in the other Washington before you board your flight to Europe.
Okay.
Thank you.